Local productions seen on Delta College Public Media are made possible with support from viewers like you. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Mike Redford, and this is the follow-up. Coming up on tonight's show, more classified documents are found at President Biden's house, garage, and offices. It comes just a few months after former President Trump's Florida home was raided, where they found hundreds of classified documents as well. Republican leaders are lashing out, claiming investigators are being soft on Biden, but tougher on Trump. Ryan Petersen, a political science professor at Delta College, is here with his perspective. Plus, President Biden visited the U.S.-Mexican border for the first time a week or so ago. But will anything come of it to stop the flow of immigrants flowing into our country? Daniel Soza works in the front lines of this issue. He will join us as well. But first, we would like to hear from you to help drive the conversation here on the show. You can do that in a variety of ways via social media on Facebook and Twitter. You can email us, or you can dial into our follow-up hotline to voice your opinion or suggest future show topics. And if you'd like to see any of our past shows this season, just log on to deltapublicmedia.org. Up first, Ryan Petersen, political science professor here at Delta College. He's a regular on the show. He's back, and we've got a good one for you tonight.
Yeah.
The 118th Congress is off to a pretty good start. Not. First, we had sort of the messy marathon trying to vote in a new House Speaker, right. 15 votes on that, kind of historic. And now we have classified documents being found at the president's homes, offices, garages, and of course nobody knows how they got there, right. Not to mention what's in these documents. This kind of stuff continues to kind of erode the public confidence in Washington. You and I included in that, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, it really does. And I think, I mean, the optics of this are absolutely terrible for Biden. Politically speaking, this is just about the worst thing that could happen to him at this particular moment in time. Legally, and I do think you have to sort of separate out the political and the legal issues, it really doesn't have any bearing on matters. Certainly it doesn't really affect anything as far as Trump's legal exposure here. But it looks really, really bad. I think in particular because Biden, was on record as criticizing Trump and saying explicitly, I know how to handle classified documents. Legally, I think we're talking about an apples and oranges situation, but I don't know that in these hyper-partisan times most people are going to make those distinctions, and it certainly gives a lot of fodder to House Republicans and to Donald Trump as well.
So the Dems will say they found just a small handful of classified documents at Biden's property, although they keep coming out on a daily basis. Several hundred at Trump's property at Mar-a-Lago. Biden supposedly immediately cooperated with investigators. Trump, on the other hand, continues to fight it. I'm not willing to give up the documents. Right. At the end of the day, they're both in the wrong, right? They shouldn't have been holding these documents in the first place.
Certainly, I mean, the answer to that has to be yes, right? I mean, that these are both violations of various laws. I do think from a legal standpoint, you are talking about some different situations here, right? That, where I think, what are we up to? About 20 documents so far have been found that were, in some way, shape, or form in Biden's possession, right, in various locations. We'll see. I'm going to reserve judgment until we know all the facts. But, it certainly seems like, this is somebody who is vice president is going to have thousands of classified documents crossing his desk. And it just feels like a situation where probably staffers at the end of the term are packing things up, and these classified documents got mixed in with things that were unclassified. Just the relatively small number, at least so far, and the fact that they're actually in different locations, to me, kind of smells like it's inadvertent, right? And the fact that when found, they were turned over to the National Archives. With Trump, we're talking about over 300 documents that do appear to have been willfully taken, and it took over a year before the government was able to get those documents back and ultimately had to execute a search warrant with that. So, in terms of legal exposure, I think, Trump is potentially the thing that he ought to be most afraid of is obstruction-related charges, whereas I think that's not going to be the case with Biden. I think Biden clearly violated the Presidential Records Act. There's really no teeth to that. There's no real penalty for that. It's possible that you would have, depending on what's in the documents and their level of classification, some other charges related to, the Espionage Act, things like that. But again, I think that's probably doubtful. It's the sort of thing that in the past would get somebody a slap on the wrist at that, at that level. But again, it muddies the waters. It gives fodder to his political opponents. The optics of it are just absolutely terrible for Biden at this moment in time, because it makes it look as though he did the exact same thing, and of course that's how it'll be portrayed by his opponents. So.
And you mentioned the optics, so the other one that doesn't look so good is the first round of classified documents that they found at the Biden Penn Center. Was a couple days before the midterms. Of course, we don't see them released until a couple months later. It's like, okay, you had this information, but that doesn't look good.
Right, and I don't know. Obviously, I have no inside information. I don't know what the decision-making process was for when or how exactly to release that. If I put myself in the position of say being on Biden's legal team and discovering there's no good time, at this moment in political history to release that information publicly. It's going to look bad, no matter what. So I'm not sure exactly how that happened. And very often in these situations, I think, if you're somebody like Joe Biden, you're going to be, I think, getting very different advice from your political advisors than you're going to be getting from your attorneys, right? Sound legal advice is often going to be very different than what may seem, at least at the moment, like sound political advice. And so there may have been some back and forth there between the political types and the legal types about when and how to do this. But
I wouldn't want to be his press secretary, because a couple days ago that's the end of it, that's all we found, and of course they found a few more, and she flat out said, well, I wasn't aware of that. It's like, oops. Here's what's interesting, I think, for our viewers, because you talk about the amount of classified documents that are out there, and we actually have a graphic to show the viewers, and I think it's important to talk about them, and here it is. There's somewhere in the order of over 50 million documents classified every year. We don't know the exact number because even the government can't keep track of it, which was my initial sort of, okay, well, who's accountable for this and how does it get like that? And the article went on to say basically they're just sort of overclassifying a lot of things. Doesn't mean that what they're doing, hanging on to these things, isn't wrong, but it does tell you there's just this volume of classified documents that maybe shouldn't be classified in the first place.
Right. Yeah. No, there is something to that. I mean, we have an extremely large bureaucratic government. If you combine military and civilian employees, you're talking about something like 4 million employees, which puts the federal government up there with like Walmart and McDonald's, in terms of largest employers. And if you're as big as Walmart or McDonald's, you're pretty big, right? This is a government then that is going to produce literally millions of documents, and millions of those are going to be classified. And as we were talking about before the show, it's a situation where there is probably no real downside for a government employee to classify a document. Whereas there are a lot of potential downsides for not classifying a document. And so I think from the perspective of somebody in the bureaucracy, stamping classified on something is probably the safer route. And then you end up in the situation that you described where you're classifying all sorts of documents that really probably don't need to be classified. And I suspect that in the case of both Biden and Trump, there are probably documents like that in those respective collections, documents that really aren't all that critical to national security or national defense.
Which is interesting because we may or may not even know what's in these classified documents until, let's say, 3 years from now, 5 years from now.
Maybe
remember
longer.
That story? They'll come out and say, you know what, there wasn't a whole lot in there, but too bad. The story came out.
Right, by that time the damage is done.
It's
over.
So the other thing I want to get into, as both sides are pointing the finger, they're doing investigations, classified documents. The GOP House Majority now has talked about, we're going to investigate, we're going to repeal everything Biden has done, and this just gets in the way of doing the business in the country. What about the business of running the country? It's on the back burner. We're like on the verge of defaulting
Yeah.
on our national debt.
Well, we've been there before.
I know, but I think this may be a little bit more serious now.
Yeah.
I mean, talking about shutting things down. Even this week, there's a looming deadline, I think Thursday.
Yeah.
We've kind of kicked the ceiling up and again, but I'm hearing this one may be a little bit different. I mean,
Right. I mean, well, you know, when it takes 15 votes to elect the speaker, this doesn't bode well for the possibilities of getting the House to raise the debt ceiling. So there is some real, you know, potential for you know, bad things happening there if they're not able to get it together. But you know, I think this just illustrates that, you know, even after the presidential election and the midterms, I mean, we are still in hyper-partisan times, and you know, this is sort of taking turns using the powers of, in this case, Congress, to investigate the other side, to try to undermine them for the next presidential election, as opposed to sitting down and doing the harder, much less glamorous work of actually governing.
Right.
And I remember fondly times when Republicans and Democrats, after the election was over, would come together and start hammering out, you know, compromises. I know you're going to be talking about immigration later in the show.
Right. Sooner than later, actually.
Yeah, you know, how you know, Republicans are you know, talking about now potentially impeaching the Secretary of Homeland Security, opening up investigations into this. Well, where is their solution? Where is their, you know, why are they not crafting legislation that could be sent over to the Senate to start solving some of these problems? And you know, neither side is doing this. It's not. There's nothing coming from the Senate being sent over to the House by Democrats either. It's a never-ending election and nonstop partisan competition, and that's not a good thing.
Which is what I talked at the beginning. The question of just continues to erode the public confidence what we're doing in Washington, and then again, we're not running the business of government that we elected you for, and it just gets so frustrating.
Yeah.
So, okay, we're going to change gears. We're going to talk a little bit about immigration as we kick the can down the road from administration to administration. Daniel Soza is coming on. He's going to join us. Ryan's going to stay with us. Daniel's been on the show a couple of times before, I think annually, because this immigration border crisis, we want to call that, continues to be a big issue, and it's important to talk about. Daniel's a volunteer with the Michigan United, their immigrant rights organization. He also works for Samaritas and Refugee Settlement. Good to have you here, my friend. It's going to be a good team here. So we've had a record number of immigrants crossing our southern border since Biden took office. It's been about 2 years. He finally made a trip there, El Paso, about a week ago, very orchestrated. Didn't find any immigrants, at least not where he was for the time he was there. And this is not a problem that he created. I get it. Lots to unpack here. So I'll start with this. What do you make of our current status in immigration and this border crisis?
So, you know, it is accurate when they report in the news, and, you know, when you see some of the other news stations talk about it, that we are seeing a huge number of border crossings. We haven't seen this larger number since 1999, 2000. So you're talking 22 years since they've been this high. But, you know, when we have this conversation, whether it's in private, you know, amongst different political parties, we rarely get to that why. Where are they coming from? And so you saw the message that the Biden administration put out about changing some of the rules for certain countries. Those countries were Nicaragua, Haiti, Cuba, Venezuela. So what's different about this wave is that the majority of those that are coming from those areas. So the rule changes that they made were actually targeted towards the surge, because typically, and in that last wave that you saw, and really up until now, most of the people who are immigrating here, whether they be immigrants or asylum seekers, come from Mexico and the Northern Triangle, which is Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras. So, you know, one of the things that we talked about earlier is that the White House sure didn't do a good job of explaining what the reason was for those rule changes, but it was actually very targeted. As far as his trip to the border, it's interesting again that you use the word immigrant, because how many of those people that you do see on the news are actually immigrants or asylum seekers? Again, asylum seekers it's a perfectly legal way to come to the United States. It's in the Constitution. But we rarely make that differentiation in the news.
They say it's, the Republicans will say, this is an open border. They're just freely coming in back and forth. That's really not the case. There's some there are some things that the board, they're being challenged a little bit, but it feels like it's open. And I think at the beginning of the Biden administration, any campaign on the fact it's open, and I think he sort of created this sort of message that come one, come all, you know.
Yeah, you know, it just guess it depends on what your definition of open is,
Yeah.
right? Are people coming here undocumented? Certainly, but many of them are coming here with work visas. They have jobs already in the country, relatives already in the country. They come with a purpose. They come here. You know, they don't qualify for any federal benefits. You know, despite some of the conversation and conspiracy theories out there, really the only thing an undocumented woman who is with child or recently had a child can qualify for is WIC, Women, Infant, Children, where they get things like peanut butter, milk, eggs, which is, you know, pretty big deal right now. But other than that, they don't qualify for any other of those social justice programs. So nobody's coming here to qualify for those or get a handout. They're almost exclusively coming here for work or to escape a life or death situation.
Right. What's interesting, you and I talked about this. The question to ask is, what is the right amount of immigration? And that's one. And then the second would be, why is it so hard for us to come up with sort of a clear policy on immigration reform that we can try to all agree on and then communicate that to the people that are trying to come here?
Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of factors that really drive that question.
Yeah.
You know, we obviously need a certain level of immigration for the labor market, right? Businesses need some of those jobs filled, you know, whether it's in the food industry, in the construction industry. There's immigration that's needed to fill those jobs. The other thing, you know, we've talked about this on your show before, is the tax base, right? One of those big things that's always discussed is the cost of illegal immigration. Well, the biggest source of tax revenue for any state is if they have sales tax, right? It's more than state income tax in almost any state. So unless an undocumented person can go into, say, a convenience store, you know, and buy items and not pay sales tax, which, come on, they pay sales tax, they're contributing in a pretty significant way to the tax base. You know, if we could figure out a way policy-wise to get those folks coming over here to be greater contributors to the state and federal tax bases, what kind of difference would that make?
Yeah.
But again, it's not even a discussion you're seeing anywhere, you know, on the legislative level at all, unless they're happening in rooms that I'm not, you know, hearing about.
Right.
Which, hey, I guess that could be possible, right? I'm not in those rooms, but you know, it's just not. We're not having the conversations to form the policy that's going to benefit those people coming and Americans as well.
Ryan, I know you have some thoughts on this. You have any questions for him?
Yeah, I was just, I mean, there's a backlog from COVID here, right? I mean, that some of what we're seeing is just that, you know, because of COVID and because of the Title 42 restrictions, which that's part of the health code, not the immigration code, created a backlog here. And then you combine that with the economy turning around and the perception that Biden is friendlier to immigration than Trump was. Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, even had Trump been in his second term, just with COVID ending, wouldn't there have been a surge? Probably anyway, and whoever was in the White House would have to be dealing with this situation. And then again, you add to that the perceptions about Biden, and it maybe expands it a little. Is that?
I think everything that you mentioned, you know, they all those things contribute to the wave that we're seeing right now. You know, you mentioned perception. There's really not a good source of communication on the other side of the border as to what U.S. policy is going to be, because, hey, we don't know what it's going to be a year or two from now, if any change at all. So some of those waves have been driven by rumors that there's going to be some type of an amnesty program, that there's going to be some type of change in immigration policy in the U.S., or that the president is friendly to immigration. Those rumors drive people to come here, you know, hoping for the best when they get here. But yeah, all those things are factors that drive immigration. COVID had a really interesting effect on drugs in America. You know, a lot of the discussion has been about crime and the undocumented. One of the things that I read from the Cato Institute, kind of a libertarian group, a little bit more, I guess, neutral on some of the immigration issues. Fentanyl, the rise that we're seeing in fentanyl right now, is due to COVID, because during those years where the border was locked down due to COVID, fentanyl became the most popularly smuggled drug because apparently it's the easiest to smuggle across the border. I have no idea why. Not in that business, thankfully, right? But it's easier to cross the border with it, and that's why you see that spike in fentanyl.
Interesting. So let's expand on that Title 42, because I think it's sort of confusing to some people. I think we maybe better define it, because that's sort of a policy you created during the height of the pandemic. You mentioned that, Ryan, under President Trump, under the guise of protecting public health, but sort of what Biden vowed to repeal it during his campaign. Instead, it's really sort of expanding, right? Is that what you're seeing out there? Yeah.
You know, it's interesting, you know, because it seems like every time we talk about changes in immigration policy, you kind of can expect that they're going to go to court, like Title 42
Right.
has. But I mean, as far as the effect, well, it's actually one of the more significant changes you've seen to immigration policy, right, in the last decade. So whether or not, I don't think that effect is going to continue, because I mean, so much from COVID has, you know, changed. And you know, you've already seen, you know, the surge going on now. So, and that's happening, you know, despite what, you know, the finality of what's going on with Title 42.
Right.
Yeah, and I mean, it was inevitable that the Title 42 restrictions were going to go away at some point.
Sure.
Because again, as I said, this is part of the public health code. It allows the Surgeon General to impose restrictions on immigration. And so this was tied specifically to COVID. And so, you know, unless we're going to continue with lockdowns and masks and everything else, it's pretty hard to sustain that. And I think you mentioned the courts. This is going to end up in the courts. Somebody's going to say, wait a minute, why are you still doing this? The Biden administration actually initially fought you know, taking away these restrictions, or at least they wanted some additional time. Eventually they ended up sort of no longer contesting it as it worked its way up the appellate process. But again, even if Trump had won a second term, this would be in the courts now, and there's a very good chance that the courts would say, no, the pandemic is over. You know, you can't keep doing. You can't use that as a pretext to shut down the border or you know, not hear asylum applications.
So when it comes to immigration, it's interesting because we focus so much on those that are coming from the Triangle in Central America, right? Honduras, Guatemala,
El Salvador.
and El Salvador, right? And then we also talked about the new policy about sort of targeting Nicaragua, Haiti, Venezuela, and Cuba. Okay, so what about those that want to flee the war-torn Ukraine or other places, maybe in Africa, where they're oppressed and there's violence? We're sort of welcoming them, I think, but why aren't they part of the equation too? I mean, isn't that immigration, it's a worldwide thing, and yet we don't really talk about that, right?
Right, we're just not having that discussion. It seems like about, you know, where do we sit in the face of the world, and those policies that have, you know, really stood for America or been part of America for, you know, our entirety, the entirety of the American existence. This has been the land of opportunity, supposedly, right?
Right.
What's it say on the Statue of Liberty? Give me you're tired, you're sick, you know, and if we're really going to look at immigration policy, then we have to have that conversation as well. Where do we stand on these things? I think we can all agree that Ukrainians don't want to be in the situation that they're in. But you know, we also do have this perception that everybody's dying to come here. You know, and you know, the Ukrainians, as much as the situation is dire where they're at, they really don't want to immigrate to the U.S. if they don't have to. They'd much prefer to stay in their country and return to their homes and rebuild their homes. Right. And you can say that about most immigrants, you know. I mean, who wants to uproot their life, leave their families, leave everything they know, and move to another country?
Right.
Nobody really wants to do that unless they have to.
Got it.
Right. Well, I mean, there's, you know, we have a sort of a contradiction in our own political culture, right? We're a nation of immigrants that has always had some anti-immigrant sentiment going back to the beginning throughout our history, which has always sort of fascinated me, that immigrants and the descendants of immigrants can then, once they're established here, become so, you know, anti-immigrant to lack compassion for people doing the same thing. And like you said, nobody really wants to leave. If things were great where they were, they would prefer to stay there. But you know, it's people seeking a better life, seeking opportunity that they don't have at that moment in political history.
This has been an issue from almost the beginning of time, certainly the beginning of this country. And I talked to Daniel before. I read something today that in 1924 Congress passed the Chinese Expulsion Act and the Johnson Act, which was an immigration sort of rights act. And they were targeting the Chinese because Americans feared they were taking jobs and selling as drugs. 1924. Boy, that sounds familiar.
You can go back to the 17 and 1800s. You can go back even before that with you know, people of English ancestry not wanting people of Irish ancestry here, and the Irish you know, resisting the immigration of Italians, and
Right.
you know, it goes on and on with each new wave. You know, so.
In the 1920s, you had the Bracero program. Shortly after the Mexican Revolution, you saw a ton of Mexicans brought to the U.S. to work in the Southwest, and some of those food industries and the growing industry
Sure.
that was that part of the country. And then not long after, you had policies that took those same braceros who were brought here to work, deporting them back to the U.S. when the U.S. no longer needed them. And you know, it's a very interesting piece of history because some Mexican American people who were in the country before Columbus were even deported as well.
Sure.
Kind of caught up in that fervor, anti-immigrant fervor. But yeah, it's almost a worldwide beginning of time kind of an issue.
Yeah, unless the American public somehow, some way stands up and really says, listen, this is important to me. Because what does it mean to people in mid-Michigan? I care about it, but I don't deal with it on a daily basis. You do more than anything else. So
Yeah.
how do we get more people just care about it, make it a huge issue so that they're going to affect some change?
There's a serious lack of accountability when it comes to the ways in which we contribute to immigration. You know, the ways we, you know, contribute to drug smuggling, for instance, right? I always say that 100% of drug smuggling, criminal drug operations, 100% funded by drug users. So if we don't address, you know, drug users, then we're always going to have drugs illegally smuggled
Right.
across the border.
Sure.
You know, if we don't address immigration policy, we're always going to have immigrants
Right.
attempting to cross illegally. So we have to take accountability and say, all right,
Yeah.
let's sit down, let's hammer this out. But I feel like you can copy and paste that to just about any issue
That's true.
that we're facing in this country today. You know,
Yeah.
if we don't talk about it in a rational level, we're not going to come to a rational conclusion, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll leave it at that. Daniel Soza, Ryan Petersen, great discussion. We'll have you back in again. It's always good perspective, some important issues. And thank you for joining us. That's the follow-up for tonight. We'll see you next Tuesday night at 8 o'clock. Have a great night, everybody.